You ready to dive into some pretty heady stuff today?
Always up for a challenge.
I think this is going to be a good one. It's one of those concepts that might seem, I don't know, kind of hidden away in the mechanics of language at first, but it's really crucial for understanding how language actually like clicks together. We're talking about underlying representations.
Ah, yes. A fundamental concept.
You sent over this chapter from a linguistics textbook. It's called Underlying Representations, and it's dense, but wow, packed with insights. So the goal today is to extract the core ideas and see why this idea of underlying representations is so powerful for anyone who's, curious about language.
Definitely. And you've provided a fantastic selection of examples from languages like Russian, Finnish, Karo, English, and a bunch more.
Yeah, I tried to pick a variety to show how widespread this idea is.
And what's so fascinating is these examples, they reveal that the way we sort of mentally organize the sounds and structures of words, it's not always a direct match with what we actually say. It's like there's this hidden level of organization going on beneath the surface.
Right, right. It's not like what you see is what you get. There's more to it.
Exactly.
So for you, the learner listening in, think of this deep dive as like getting a backstage pass to the inner workings of language. We're going to explore those hidden structures, see how they explain these sometimes surprising ways that words change their shape and sound depending on the context.
It's all about uncovering the patterns, the rules that govern how language behaves.
Exactly. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll have this, I don't know, a new way of looking at language, a deeper appreciation for how it all works, almost like you've gained some kind of linguistic superpower.
I like that. Linguistic superpowers.
Okay, so let's unpack this concept. The chapter starts off by, making a case for why understanding these underlying forms is so important. And one of the big reasons they highlight is this thing called neutralization. What's the gist of that?
Or neutralization, it happens when two or more underlying sounds, which are distinct in our minds, in our mental representation of the language, they end up sounding exactly the same when we actually speak them in certain situations.
Ah, okay. So it's like in our heads, we know they're different, but when we say them out loud, they can kind of collapse into the same sound.
Precisely. And the textbook gives a clear example from Russian nouns. They compare the nominative singular form, which is like the basic form of a noun, with the genitive singular, which often expresses possession, like of something.
Right. Like I remember this from the reading of Vagon versus Vagona, wagon and of the wagon. And it's not just the vowel that changes, is it?
You're right. It's not just the vowel. Sometimes the final consonant shifts as well. It's more complex than just adding an ending.
Yeah, it's subtle.
And the textbook gives us this whole list of these Russian noun pairs. Автомобиль and автомобила share and of the car, вечер evening and of the evening. They go on and on.
It's like a whole system.
Exactly. A system. And if we only focused on these spoken forms, these surface forms, we might think, oh, they're totally different words. But the idea of an underlying representation, this allows us to see more fundamental similarity between them.
Okay, so we're not just memorizing a bunch of different forms, we're finding the common thread, the blueprint.
Yes, the blueprint. The theory is that the underlying forms were more like wagon, Aftonbale, вечер, and then there's a rule that kicks in and adds the A in the genitive singular. So what we perceive as different vowels on the surface, they might actually come from the same underlying vowel.
So it's like the language is being more efficient than it seems at first glance.
Exactly. Economical.
And you mentioned earlier that the underlying form also has to account for those consonant shifts in some of those words.
Right. Those consonant changes, they also need a systematic explanation. So the underlying representation has to be, in a way, abstract to capture all these variations.
It has to be flexible enough to account for all those changes.
Exactly. It's about finding the most general, most efficient way to represent the patterns in the language.
Okay, and then another key concept that the chapter dives into is alternations. And these are basically changes in the form of a morpheme. And just to remind everyone, a morpheme is that smallest unit of meaning in language. It could be a word or part of a word.
Right, like prefixes, suffixes, root words, all those building blocks of meaning.
Yeah, exactly. So alternations are how these morphemes change their form depending on where they pop up in a sentence or a word. And the textbook uses this example of voiced and voiceless obstruents in Russian, which I found really interesting. Could you unpack that a bit for us?
Of course. So in Russian, an obstruent, which is a type of consonant where the airflow is, significantly blocked, like the sounds S, Z, P, B. When it's at the end of a word, it always becomes voiceless when spoken.
Voiceless meaning what the vocal cords don't vibrate.
Exactly. So you have an underlying form like sad, meaning garden, but because of this rule, it gets pronounced as sat with a voiceless T at the end.
Ah, okay, so the underlying form has that voice D, but the rule changes it to a voiceless T when it's in that final position.
Precisely. And the same thing happens with Gora, meaning mountain. It's pronounced Gora because of that final devoicing rule. But when you add an ending, like in the genitive form sada, you hear that voice D coming back. Sada.
Ah, interesting. So the rule only applies when that consonant is at the very end of a word.
Yes, that's the key context for this rule. And we see similar patterns with other words like dub becoming dup for oak and grib becoming grip for mushroom.
So the underlying form is like this more stable version, the blueprint, and the spoken form gets adjusted based on these phonetic rules.
That's a great way to put it. The underlying form is more stable, more consistent.
And this leads us to kind of refine our understanding of what we even mean by an underlying form, right? Like the textbook emphasizes that we can't actually see or hear these underlying forms directly.
Right. They're theoretical constructs. They're tools that linguists use to model how language is organized in our minds.
Yeah.
It's a way of representing that mental grammar.
So they're not like physically present in the brain.
Not in a way that we can directly observe. They're part of our model, our theory of how language works.
Okay, so it's our best guess at how the brain is like organizing these patterns. And then that mental organization is processed, run through what linguists call the phonological component, and that spits out the surface form, which is what we actually say and hear.
Precisely. It's a multi-step process.
And it seems like morphology, how words are structured and built with prefixes and suffixes, that plays a big role in shaping these phonological processes.
Absolutely. Morphology and phonology are deeply interconnected.
The textbook brings up Russian plural formation again, mentioning how forms like pruta, meaning ponds, and prud, meaning pond, they point towards this underlying system that accounts for the vowel changes and the different endings.
Right. The way we form plurals, by adding suffixes or making other changes to the word, it can trigger these sound changes in the base word.
So it's not just about sticking an ending on there, it can have these ripple effects throughout the word.
Exactly. And to really grasp these spoken forms, these surface forms, we need to posit these more abstract underlying representations. They're like the blueprints that then get modified by these rules.
And what I found really fascinating is how the textbook then brings in all this evidence from a whole bunch of different languages, to support this idea of underlying representations. It's not just a Russian thing or an English thing. It seems to be pretty universal.
It's a fundamental concept in linguistics, applicable across languages.
Like, let's take Finnish, for example. They talk about the nominative and the partitive cases, which might be a bit new for some listeners. But essentially, the partitive case in Finnish, it often indicates a partial amount of something or an ongoing action. So it's kind of like saying some of something.
Right. It's a way of expressing a part of a whole or an incomplete action.
And what's cool is how Finnish illustrates this concept of underlying forms really nicely. Like take the word amu, which means morning. In the partitive, it becomes amua.
Yes. And similarly, you have hopea, meaning silver, which changes to hopea in the partitive. It's that addition of the A and what sounds like a lengthening of the final vowel.
Right, right. So the underlying forms and the rules that operate on them, they have to explain these systematic changes across these different grammatical forms. We're seeing that, again, what might seem like different vowel sounds on the surface, they might actually have this more unified representation underneath.
Yes, the underlying representation captures the commonality between these forms.
It's like this template, and the grammar is telling us how that template should be pronounced in different situations. And then there's Karewi. Oh man, Karewi. That was a fun one.
A language with some really interesting consonant changes, depending on the verb form.
Yeah, it shows how the structure of a word, its morphology, can directly impact how it sounds, its phonology. Like we see these changes in the very first consonant of the verb, depending on whether it's in the infinitive form, the to form of the verb, or these different habitual forms, or the imperative, which is the command form.
Right, and the examples they give illustrate this really well. You have kupamba, meaning to adorn, but then it shifts to new pamba for I habitually adorn. A pamba for he or she habitually adorns, and pamba for adorn, the command.
So many changes.
And what's key is that shift in that initial consonant from a K to an N to what's written as an A, which might actually represent a dropped consonant or even its complete absence.
Right. It's like the consonant is, I don't know, disappearing and reappearing.
It's alternating. And these changes, they suggest an underlying form that's being modified by these prefixes, these grammatical markers that are attached to the verb.
So prefixes aren't just passively stuck onto the front, they're actively interacting with the core of the verb, changing it.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process.
This really highlights that there's this deeper level of organization going on than just, stringing sounds together. And even in English, which, sometimes feels like it doesn't have as many um, obvious changes as some other languages, even in English, we still see evidence for these underlying representations, right? The textbook mentions English plurals as a good example.
Absolutely. A classic example. Think about the English plural ending. S.
Yeah, yeah, like cats, dogs, houses.
Exactly. But it can be pronounced in 3 different ways, depending on the sound that comes before it. S, like in capes, Z, like in cabs, and les, like in cats.
Right, so it sounds like 3 different endings, but it's really just the one ending changing its pronunciation.
Precisely. And the fact that these pronunciations are so predictable, so rule-governed, it strongly suggests that there's a single underlying plural ending, most likely either Z or S, and then there are rules that adjust how it's pronounced based on that preceding sound.
So instead of having to store 3 completely separate plural endings in our minds, we have this one underlying form and a set of rules. It's way more efficient.
It's much more efficient, yes.
And what about that example from Jita with tones? That one adds another layer to think about. For listeners who might not be familiar with tone languages, these are languages where the pitch of a syllable can actually change the meaning of a word.
Right. It's not just about the consonants and vowels. The melody of the word is crucial too.
Exactly. And Jita shows us how these underlying tones, which are, essential for distinguishing different words, they can also be realized differently depending on the surrounding words, the grammatical context.
The examples they give, like okujima, low, high, high, meaning to hit, and okukiima, low, high, low, to hit 4, they illustrate this really well. Even okusima, low, high, high, meaning to block. The tones are different, even though the verbs seem related in meaning.
So it's like the tones are like dancing around depending on the other words they're with.
Yes, they're interacting. And to understand these spoken tones, these surface tones, we need to consider their underlying forms and how they're being affected by these prefixes and suffixes that attach to the verb.
Okay, so it's not just the basic sounds. These features like tone, they also have underlying representations that can be tweaked and modified in different contexts.
Exactly. Tone is part of the system too.
And then the textbook brings in these examples from Chamorro, looking at how vowels in the verb roots can change depending on the suffixes attached to them.
Yes, Chamorro is another great example of how the grammar of a language, its morphology, influences the sounds, the phonology. They show us examples like guaon, meaning fish, which becomes iguaon when you add the article the, and similarly, gamor.ne house becomes igamor.ne for the house.
So the vowel in the root of the noun, it's shifting when you add that article I.
Right. And this suggests that there's an underlying form of the noun and it undergoes a vowel change in the presence of this particular grammatical marker.
It's like the grammar is actively shaping the pronunciation in this really fundamental way.
Yes, it's not just about adding sounds together. The grammar itself influences the sounds.
And we see something similar, I think, with Korean final consonant neutralization, where different consonants at the end of a syllable can end up, being pronounced the same way.
Absolutely. Korean is a great illustration of this neutralization process. While there might be different consonants at the end of a syllable in the underlying form, like in pap, pronounced pap, meaning rice, and Pam, pronounced Pam, meaning chestnut. Those final consonants, they often get pronounced the same way in certain contexts.
So our ears might be hearing the same sound, but in our minds at this deeper level, we're still distinguishing those underlying forms.
Precisely. There's a disconnect between the mental representation and the actual pronunciation.
And then the kimatumbi tone example, that was a cool one too, showing how the tone of a word can change just based on whether or not it's followed by another word.
Tone and connected speech. It's fascinating. A word like lukalalo, hi-lo-lo, meaning ho, might have a certain melody when it's pronounced in isolation, but when it's followed by another word, as in the phrase nga lukalalo li hi-lo-lo, hi-lo, it isn't a ho, The tone on that first syllable changes.
That's so subtle. It's like these tiny shifts in pitch are carrying all this meaning.
Exactly. And this suggests an underlying tonal pattern for the word that can be affected by the surrounding words, by the sentence context.
It's not just rules within a word, it's rules that operate across words.
Right. The sentence is a phonological environment, too.
And then we have Samoan perfective aspect, which is, well, I'll admit, that one tripped me up a little bit. But the basic idea is that adding a suffix that marks a completed action can actually trigger vowel changes in the stem of the verb.
Samoan perfective aspect, yes. It's another example of how adding a grammatical marker, a suffix in this case, can impact the sounds of the verb itself, the root of the word. When you add the perfective suffixes ia or nia, they can cause changes in the vowel of the verb stem.
Right, right. Like olo, rub, becoming oloya in the perfective, or anu, meaning plant, becoming anunia. So these vowel changes, they're not random. They're based on the underlying form of the verb and the specific suffix that's being used.
Precisely. There are systematic rules at play, determined by the grammar.
It's like that suffix isn't just a tag-on, it carries these instructions for how to modify the core of the word.
A blueprint for pronunciation.
And then the textbook moves on to this idea of underlying forms and how they relate to multiple forms of a word, what linguists call a paradigm. And they use palo and verb tenses as an example.
Paradigms.
Yes.
This is where the real power of underlying representations becomes clear. When we look at all the different forms that a verb can take, present, middle, future conservative in the case of Palawan, it seems like these various spoken forms are all derived from a single underlying root.
So we have this one root form, and then it's like dressed up in different ways to express different tenses.
A great analogy.
Yeah.
And the differences we hear, they're not due to completely different verbs. They're due to the addition of these prefixes and suffixes and the application of phonological rules that are triggered by those affixes.
So instead of having to memorize a completely different form for every single tense, our brains can just store this one underlying form and then apply the appropriate morphological and phonological operations to create the specific tense we need.
Much more efficient for the verb.
Way more efficient.
Yeah.
And then finally, the textbook wraps up by, talking about cross-linguistic variation, reminding us that even in a language like English, which maybe doesn't have as many super obvious changes as some other languages, even in English, these underlying representations are at work. The example that comes to mind is the vowel change in sane versus sanity.
Yes, English has its own patterns of alternations, suggesting underlying forms and rules, even if they're not always as transparent as in some other languages.
Right. So while English might not have as many visible shifts in word forms as, say, Russian or Finnish, we still see these systematic alternations in related words.
Like insane, insanity, serene, and serenity.
Exactly, and that suggests that there are underlying forms and rules operating beneath the surface, even if those rules are, maybe a bit more historically rooted or not as uniformly applied across the board.
It's about recognizing the patterns, the systematicity, even in the apparent irregularities of language.
I love that. Okay, let's summarize this all for you, the learner, tuning in. The key takeaway here is that linguists, they're proposing these underlying representations, these kind of abstract mental blueprints, to explain the often really surprising ways that words appear when we actually speak them. Mm-hmm. From those vowel shifts in Russian nouns to the consonant changes in Karawi verbs to the tonal variations in Jita, the main point is that there's this more consistent, more fundamental level of organization happening beneath the surface.
Yes, the surface forms we hear are just the tip of the iceberg.
It's like language has this secret code. And this idea of underlying representations, it helps us see how those seemingly unpredictable changes are actually the result of these systematic rules.
It's about understanding that language isn't random. It's governed by principles, by patterns.
And for you, grasping this concept gives you this much richer understanding of how language is structured, how it works. It shows us that language isn't just this, this jumble of sounds and words. It's a system. It has this internal logic, this elegance. And that, honestly, can deepen your appreciation for how we communicate, how we put our thoughts into words, and how different languages approach this task in their own unique ways.
It's about seeing the beauty and the complexity of language.
Exactly. And this leads to, I think, a really thought-provoking question. If these underlying forms, if they're not actually spoken, if they exist as these abstract representations in our minds, What does that tell us about how our brains are actually processing and storing language? Like,
Hmm.
are these underlying forms closer to the, I don't know, to the true essence of a word, and the spoken forms are just these, temporary context-dependent variations? It really makes you think about what language even is and how our minds make sense of it all.
It raises questions about the nature of linguistic knowledge, about the relationship between thought and sound.
Big questions. Definitely something to ponder. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into underlying representations. Hope you found it as mind-bending as we did. Until next time, keep exploring the wonders of language.